Identity to me is something that's practical. It's your identity is it's like a dramatic role that you play out in the world. And while playing that out, it has to furnish you with a life. And what that means is that it means that it has to be negotiated with other people. And when you're a very young child and you first start to play with who you are, you live in a fantasy world. And according to some developmental psychologists, at least, particularly this is grounded in the theories of Piaget, that very young children, 2 or 3, are quite egocentric in their play. They play according to their own rules. And so they're not social yet until they're 3 or 4, which means that they have their own goals in mind, and then they erect a little fictional world around those goals, and then they play out the role within that fictional world, and that's pretend play. And when they get to be about 3 or 4, and they start playing with other kids, they have to bring their worlds together and negotiate, because both children have to want to play. And so that means identity has to expand beyond its egocentric focus and increasingly be negotiated in the social world. I studied developmental psychology for a long time, especially in relationship to the regulation of aggression. And most children learn to regulate their aggression between the ages of 2 and 4. For example, for instance, there's a subset of children, mostly male, who are very aggressive at the age of 2, comparatively speaking. They bite, kick, fight, hit, and steal. That's the definition of aggressive. And almost all those children are socialized out of that by the time they're 4, although a small proportion aren't, and they tend to be long-term antisocial children and then criminal adults. It's very, very difficult for that to be rectified if it isn't rectified by 4. What happens with most children is they learn to move beyond their egocentric presuppositions and include other children in the play. And so they start to negotiate the roles. And a sophisticated identity is a negotiated role. And of course, this is the case, because first of all, if you're a child and you want friends, then you can't insist that only your game be played. So I'll give you an example. There's been observational studies of children in playgrounds. So imagine there's a group of children together. Let's say they're 6 or 7 years old, and they're playing helicopter. So they've got their erasers out and they're buzzing around in the helicopters. Okay, so they've already established the ground rules. They've got together and they laid out the drama. They say, well, let's play helicopter. And maybe there's 4 or 5 suggestions, but the group develops a consensus that helicopter's the fun game. And let's make our erasers into helicopters. I don't have an eraser. Well, you can use your pencil and it can be a long helicopter. And so everybody gets a roll and everybody's happy about it. Otherwise, play won't continue, right? Everybody has to be happy or play won't continue. And so then the little drama organizes itself and the kids play helicopter, and there's consequences of that play out like a story. And then maybe another kid comes along and he's got an eraser and a pencil in his bag and he wants to play helicopter too. And if he's a socially sophisticated kid, he'll hang around the outside of the little game and watch. And then he'll take out his eraser and maybe start making buzzing noises with it. And when he can see that there's an opening in the play situation, he'll swoop in and maybe he'll get integrated. It's like when you're at a cocktail party and you hear a conversation and you're hovering around the edge. You wait for an opening and then you say something that's germane to the topic. And if you're sophisticated enough and the people are friendly enough, then it'll open and you'll be allowed in. Now, even popular kids often get rebuffed when they try to enter an already structured game. Unpopular kids don't watch what's going on, and then they come along and try to impose their game on the entire group, and then they have a tantrum if they don't get let in. And so that's a good example of how identity is negotiated at the earliest stages. The underlying presupposition there is that in our phenomenological landscape, so that's the world as we experience it, complete with emotions and motivations and dreams, and so the full range of human experience, including the subjective and the objective, let's say, can broadly be broken into two domains. And one is the domain of things that are beyond our grasp and reach, and that's the unknown. The unknown emerges. When the unknown emerges, you tend to experience anxiety. And then there's the known, and I define the known very specifically and very carefully. The known is the place you are when what you're doing produces the results you want. And I say want because that brings motivation and emotion into the game. So you're motivated to pursue something. You pursue it, and what you want happens. Not only do you get what you want, but you get validation for the structure that governs your perceptions and your actions. Now, if you imagine that you're lonely, and you approach a young woman in a social situation, attempting to make some contact with her, you want to alleviate your loneliness, and so you hope you make a good impression, and you tell a joke, let's say, in a relatively awkward manner, and you get rebuffed. Then you feel you're no longer where you control. You're no longer where you exercise control. And that brings up all sorts of specters immediately. It's like, well, why were you rebuffed? Well, maybe all women are to be despised. That's one theory. Maybe there's something deeply wrong with you. Maybe you're having an off day. Maybe it wasn't a very good joke. And so when you don't get what you want, then a landscape of questions emerge, and those questions can resonate through different levels of your identity, from the trivial, oh, I told the joke wrong, to the profound, there's nothing desirable about me and I'll be alone for the rest of my life. Now, you asked about identity, and I used the example of a child's game, but I could go through an identity. So I do this particularly in maps of meaning. And so, for example, let's say I'm sitting typing. Okay, we could decompose my identity. So at the highest level of resolution, I'm moving my fingers. And so that could be my identity. I'm the thing that moves its fingers. And then at a slightly broader level than that, I'm typing words. And at a broader level, I'm typing phrases and thinking them up, and then sentences, and then paragraphs, and then chapters, and then, let's say, full papers or books. That's a productive unit. So I'm the author of a book or the author of a paper. That's an identity. But then that's nested inside, for me, it would be nested inside being a clinical psychologist, being a professor, being a good citizen. And then that's nested inside something that's even broader than that. And I would say that that's nested inside a cultural heroism. And I don't mean that specific to me. I mean that for everyone. That's the outermost level, whether you're playing out the role of hero or adversary, say. That's the highest possible level of identity. That's the level at which fundamental morality is adjudicated. And there isn't really anything beyond. Outside that it's beyond us. It's the transcendent itself. And you're all of those at any one time. You're all of those levels of identity. But those are all practical, right? So those are the roles that you're playing in the world. All of those are a consequence of who you are, but in interplay, like in this situation with the child, all of that's negotiated with other people. And so if you have a functional identity, when you act it out in the world, then you get what you want and need. And if an identity doesn't do that, well, then you either retool your identity or you retool the world. If you're retooling your conception of the world, then you're retooling yourself. No, you can actually, not only do we perceive the world, but we also interact with it so that it does manifest itself in accordance with our desires. There's limits, obviously, to how far you can go or how far you should go with that. And what are the limits? Well, there's practical limits. Nature won't do what you want it to unless you're very sophisticated in your application of your knowledge, and other people will object. So now you might say, well, you should forge forward regardless of their objection. And, there are circumstances under which that's true. But generally speaking, that's not a very good idea. It certainly doesn't make you popular as a child. And so that brings up one other issue. I would also say, and you go from egocentrism as a child, you have to go through this period where you're socialized as a child and adolescent. And that really means that you allow your identity to be molded and shaped by the group. And you think about how important friends and peers are to children and adolescents. Your mother will say when you're a teenager, well, if Johnny jumped off the bridge, would you too? And you say, well, no. But the real answer is, well, probably. If all your friends are there taunting you, you would in fact jump off the bridge. And not only that, generally speaking, you should. Because it's your duty, it's your developmental duty as a child and a teenager to take your isolated self and turn it into a functioning social unit. Now, you could say, well, Peterson wants everybody to be a functional social unit, a robot, a cog in the wheel. And I would say, well, that isn't where development stops. It has to go through that period before you can emerge as a genuine individual, which means you have to know the rules of the game before you can break them. But not being able to abide by the rules is not anything like being a genuine creative individual. Those are not the same thing. And there's plenty of attempt to confuse the two things, because it's much better, if you can't follow the rules, to view yourself as a avant-garde revolutionary than as a failure. And it's not like I don't know that social molding crushes. Obviously it crushes, and everyone feels that. These are existential problems. Everyone deals with the tyranny of culture and the fact that it does want you to be a certain way and not other ways, and those ways might not be in keeping with the deepest elements of your nature. Well, tough luck for you. Because you're also the beneficiary of culture. And so you have to offer it your pound of flesh. Now, you shouldn't do that at the expense of your soul, but you shouldn't stay an immature child either. Well, there is the idea, for example, that your identity is whatever you say it is, and that everyone else has to go along with that. No, that isn't how it works, partly because no one even knows how to go along with it. Like, let's say, just for example, that you're gender non-binary. Okay, what am I supposed to do about that? Man, I don't know. I hardly know what to do if the rules are already there. So let's say I grow up, being a heterosexual male, I want to find a woman, fall in love with her, raise a family, have children, have grandchildren. That's a game. I know the rules to it. Not well, because everyone's a failure at that. It's very difficult, but at least you kind of know what the goal is, and so does the person you're with. Well, you leap out of that, which is already terribly difficult. You leap out of that into completely unknown territory, saying that I'm presenting yourself as something other than those categories leaves everyone around you and you completely bereft of direction. These things are easy.